When my father passed away, my sister immediately claimed his $50 million empire and our family mansion. She kicked me out the very next day, laughing that I was nothing without our dad. 5 days later, the family lawyer looked her dead in the eye and asked if she had even bothered to read the actual will. You will not believe the look on her face when she realized who truly owned everything. I am Chloe, 35 years old, and still trying to process how quickly blood turns to poison when money is involved. I run a highly successful high-end corporate catering and event planning firm, a business I built entirely on my own from the ground up. But to my family, I was always just the hired help. It was barely 24 hours since we lowered my father, Harrison, into the ground. The scent of funeral lilies and damp earth still clung to my clothes as I stood in my childhood bedroom, silently zipping up my heavy leather duffel bag. I was emotionally exhausted, drained from days of playing the strong one while my mother and sister performed their theatrical grief for the cameras and wealthy guests. The door to my bedroom flew open so hard the brass handle slammed against the drywall, leaving a noticeable dent. My older sister, Vanessa, marched in. She was 39 years old and impeccably dressed in a black designer suit that cost more than most people make in a month. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was holding up after burying the only parent who actually cared about me. Instead, she marched right up to me and dropped a crisp, freshly printed spreadsheet directly onto my neatly made bed. It was a formal eviction notice, complete with an itemized timeline of when I needed to vacate the premises. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Trust me, you are going to want to stick around to see how I handled this ultimate betrayal. Vanessa crossed her arms, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the pale afternoon light filtering through my window. With a cold, triumphant smile, she informed me that Dad's entire $50 million estate, including this $8 million mansion we were currently standing in, was now solely hers. She said it was time for me to pack up my little cooking pots and leave her property immediately. Her husband, Kyle, trailed into the room right behind her. Kyle was a 42-year-old white man who had failed at 3 different tech startups, but still walked around with the unearned, staggering confidence of a successful venture capitalist. He had always looked down on my family, despite the fact that his entire lifestyle was funded by my father's hard work. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury I could not afford right now, and I refused to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I calmly turned back to my closet and continued packing my designer travel bags. Vanessa always assumed Dad bought these luxury bags for me to keep me quiet, but every single stitch of leather was paid for by my own sweat and tears. I had spent the last decade building my catering business, pulling 18-hour shifts, negotiating ruthless vendor contracts, and scrubbing commercial kitchen floors at 2 in the morning. I earned everything I owned. While I carefully folded my clothes, Kyle actually pulled a bright yellow tape measure from his designer jeans pocket. He stepped out into the hallway right outside my open door and started measuring the width of the corridor. He muttered something to Vanessa about needing to knock down the load-bearing walls to build a custom golf simulator because the current layout was too restrictive for his swing. My chest tightened at the sheer audacity and profound disrespect of the moment. My father, a proud African-American man, had built his massive logistics empire from a single rusted delivery truck. He poured his absolute life force into building his company. He bought this sprawling estate to prove that our family had made it, that we belonged in this exclusive zip code, just as much as anyone else. And here was Kyle, a man who had never worked a truly hard day in his entire life, casually planning to demolish my father's legacy before the cemetery dirt had even settled over his casket. "You have exactly 2 hours, Chloe," Kyle said, letting the metal tape measure snap back into its plastic casing with a sharp, aggressive click. "We have high-end contractors coming tomorrow morning to start the renovations. We cannot have your stuff cluttering up the staging area." I paused, holding a silk blouse, and looked at him, I looked at this man who had openly mocked my father's old school work ethic at Thanksgiving dinners, now eagerly measuring the spoils of my father's exhausting labor. Then I looked at Vanessa. She was perfectly polished, incredibly arrogant, and completely dependent. She had never balanced a checkbook, never successfully negotiated a business contract, and had lived her entire adult life on an unlimited allowance. She was the golden child, forever protected by our mother, Beverly, who always praised Vanessa's lighter skin and perfect aesthetic while handing me the broom and telling me to make myself useful in the background. 2 hours, Vanessa echoed, stepping closer to my bed and tapping her manicured fingernail against the eviction spreadsheet. And leave your house keys on the kitchen island. Oh, and do not even think about taking any of the artwork or the good silver. I already had the estate appraiser inventory everything this morning while you were at the cemetery making arrangements with the groundskeeper. They really thought they had won. They thought my silence was an admission of defeat and submission. I finished zipping my heavy bag and hoisted the thick strap over my shoulder, adjusting the weight. Don't worry, Vanessa, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and incredibly steady. I only take what belongs to me. I do not need a single dime of your blood money. The air in the house felt heavy and suffocating as I walked out of my bedroom. As I carried my bags down the grand, sweeping staircase, walking past Kyle, who was now aggressively tapping on his phone to call his interior designer, I felt a profound sense of isolation. My father was the only one in this massive house who had truly seen me. He understood the hustle. He knew exactly what it took to build something substantial out of absolutely nothing. When I started my catering firm, I did not ask him for a handout. I wanted to earn my place at the table. And I did. I catered massive corporate galas, high-profile celebrity weddings, and million-dollar charity events. I built a roster of elite, demanding clients who respected my vision. But to Vanessa and my mother, I was just a glorified cook who smelled like garlic and onions. They looked down on the very labor that built the generational wealth they so desperately wanted to consume. I made my way to the main foyer. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint, hollow sound of a daytime talk show coming from the formal living room. My mother, Beverly, was sitting on the plush cream-colored sofa, delicately sipping a cup of chamomile tea. She did not even look up as I dragged my heavy bags toward the massive mahogany front doors. "Mom," I said quietly, stopping at the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She finally turned her head. Her eyes were completely dry. She had spent the entire funeral playing the tragic, glamorous widow, but here in the privacy of our home, she just looked deeply annoyed by the inconvenience of my presence. "Chloe, please," she sighed, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Just be the bigger person and leave quietly. Vanessa is under a tremendous amount of stress right now. She has a whole corporate empire to manage. Do not make this transition harder than it has to be." The betrayal stung deep in my chest, but it was not entirely surprising. My mother had always enabled Vanessa's worst behavior. In her eyes, Vanessa was the delicate flower that needed constant watering and protection, while I was the sturdy oak tree expected to weather every brutal storm completely alone. I was expected to absorb the family's stress, manage all the difficult logistics, and graciously step aside when the financial rewards were finally handed out. That was the unspoken rule of our household. The expectation that I would sacrifice my own well-being for the comfort of my lighter-skinned sister was a toxic dynamic I had endured for 35 years. I did not argue with her. Arguing with Beverly was like trying to empty the vast ocean with a tiny teacup. It was exhausting and entirely pointless. I simply nodded, turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me, and walked out the front door without looking back. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing me out of the only childhood home I had ever known. The late afternoon air was thick and humid. I loaded my bags into the spacious trunk of my luxury SUV, a vehicle I bought outright with my own company's hard-earned profits. I took one last long look at the sprawling brick estate. I took in the perfectly manicured hedges, the tall grand windows, and the flawless facade that successfully hid so much emotional rot inside. I slid into the driver's seat and firmly pressed the ignition button. The engine purred to life. Just as I put the car in drive, my phone buzzed brightly on the passenger seat. I leaned over and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Mr. Sterling, my father's longtime corporate attorney. Mr. Sterling was a shrewd, brilliant, no-nonsense man who had helped my father successfully navigate decades of cutthroat business deals. He was fiercely loyal to my dad, and by extension, he knew exactly who in the family actually possessed my father's sharp business acumen. I picked up the phone and opened the message. The words glowed brightly against the dark screen. "Let them celebrate," the message read. "See you at the official reading on Friday. Bring the red folder." A slow, quiet smile spread across my face, replacing the grief with a sudden surge of cold determination. I locked my phone, pulled out of the long, circular driveway, and merged onto the busy main road. Let Kyle measure his ridiculous golf simulator. Let Vanessa claim her fragile paper crowns and her hollow titles. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. I kept my eyes on the road, the hum of my SUV tires grounding me as the sprawling gates of my father's estate disappeared in my rearview mirror. The 2 hours I had spent packing up the rest of my life played on a relentless loop in my mind. Kyle standing in the doorway of the garage with his arms crossed, watching with a smug grin as I loaded thousands of dollars worth of commercial catering equipment that he dared to call my little cooking pots. My mother standing in the kitchen doorway, her silence a loud and crushing endorsement of my sudden eviction. But Mr. Sterling's text message was a burning ember in my pocket. "Bring the red folder." I knew exactly what was in that folder, and the anticipation of Friday was the only thing keeping my hands steady on the steering wheel. I pulled into the private parking lot of my commercial catering facility. The massive brick building was my true sanctuary. The smell of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and searing meats hit me the moment I walked through the double steel doors. My lead chef, a brilliant culinary artist named Jamal, looked up from a massive stainless steel prep table. He took one look at my face and the heavy duffel bag on my shoulder and immediately ordered the kitchen staff to take my bags to the private suite above the offices. This was the empire I had built. While Vanessa was swiping my dad's credit cards at high-end boutiques, I was here, securing commercial leases, negotiating with vendors, and building a brand that the entire city respected. I took a quick shower in my office suite, changed into a sharply tailored black crepe dress, and mentally prepared myself for the evening. It was time for the family repast. In our culture, the post-funeral gathering is a sacred tradition. It is supposed to be a time of deep comfort, filled with shared memories, soulful food, and the warmth of extended family wrapping their arms around the grieving. But when I arrived at the grand ballroom of the boutique downtown hotel that Vanessa had booked, I immediately felt a wave of profound disgust. Vanessa had not organized a memorial for our father. She had orchestrated a tacky, high-society networking mixer. There was no soul music softly playing in the background to honor his roots. Instead, a string quartet was playing generic pop covers in the corner. Waiters carried trays of tiny, unidentifiable appetizers that looked more like modern art projects than actual food. And there was Kyle, moving through the crowd of our grieving aunts and uncles, aggressively handing out his sleek black business cards to anyone who looked wealthy enough to fund his next doomed tech venture. He was practically stepping over my father's fresh grave to pitch his cryptocurrency startup to Dad's old business associates. I had barely taken 2 steps into the room when a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. I turned to see my mother, Beverly. Her face was tight with disapproval, her dark eyes darting nervously around the room to see who had noticed my arrival. She pulled me roughly toward the hallway leading to the hotel kitchens, away from the wealthy guests. "What are you doing here looking like that, Chloe?" she hissed, looking me up and down. "You were supposed to be here 4 hours ago to manage the catering staff. Vanessa had to hire an outside vendor at the last minute because you refused to step up. Do you know how much this cost us?" I stared at her, genuinely shocked by the audacity of her words. Mom, we buried Dad this morning, I said, keeping my voice low but completely firm. I am his daughter, not the hired help. And considering Vanessa kicked me out of the house and told me I was cut off from the family, why exactly would I provide $50,000 worth of premium catering for free? Beverly scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound that made my stomach turn. This is exactly why your sister is the one in charge now. You have always been so selfish, Chloe. Always thinking about your little business instead of supporting your family. Your father left everything to Vanessa because he knew she had the grace to handle the public face of this family. You are supposed to be the backbone, not the star. You need to go back out there, apologize to Kyle for your attitude earlier, and try to make yourself useful. The absolute delusion in her words felt like a physical blow to the chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. This was the black tax in its purest, most toxic form. The unspoken expectation that my hard work, my financial resources, and my emotional labor were community property for the family to consume, while Vanessa was treated like a delicate investment that needed constant protection and praise. No, Mom, I replied calmly, gently but firmly removing her hand from my wrist. I will not be apologizing to the man who is using my father's funeral to secure seed money. And I will not be serving appetizers to people who do not even know Dad's middle name. Excuse me. I walked away from her and headed straight for the buffet table to grab a glass of water. I needed a moment to center myself before I spoke to my Aunt Shirley and Uncle David. But peace was never an option with Kyle in the room. He spotted me and immediately abandoned a group of older, distinguished investors to intercept me. Well, if it isn't the family cook, Kyle announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to turn the heads of the people standing nearby. He leaned against the buffet table, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. His face was flushed with alcohol and unearned arrogance. I am surprised you showed up, Chloe, especially after Vanessa practically had to fumigate your old bedroom this afternoon. I poured myself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher, refusing to give him the satisfaction of making eye contact right away. I am here to pay respects to my family, Kyle, something you clearly know absolutely nothing about. Kyle let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. Come on, Chloe, do not be bitter. We all know your little kitchen hobby is struggling to pay the rent. But hey, since Vanessa and I are officially running the Harrison Empire now, I might have a spot for you. My new startup is going to need a cafeteria manager. I can start you at minimum wage. It is a step down from your fancy private dinners, but at least it will keep you off the streets now that you are effectively homeless. A heavy silence fell over the immediate area. Several of my father's old business associates, including a few high-level city officials, paused their conversations to watch the exchange. Kyle was smiling a wide, predatory smile, waiting for me to shrink away in embarrassment. Instead, I took a slow sip of my water, set the glass down on the crisp white linen, and turned to face him directly. A cafeteria manager, I repeated, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. That is a very generous offer, Kyle, especially coming from a man who had to borrow gas money from my father just 3 months ago. Kyle's smug smile instantly vanished. The red flush on his neck spread rapidly to his cheeks. But I think I will have to pass, I continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my black dress. You see, my little kitchen hobby just catered the mayor's charity gala last weekend. The exact same gala you tried to buy tickets for, but your credit card was declined at the door. So, please, keep your minimum wage job. I think you are going to need the money much more than I will very soon. Someone in the crowd let out a low, audible whistle. Kyle opened his mouth to speak, but he was completely paralyzed by the sudden public humiliation. He looked around wildly, realizing that the wealthy investors he had been trying to impress all night had heard every single word of our exchange. They were now looking at him not as a visionary entrepreneur, but as a pathetic grifter. Vanessa, seeing her husband publicly humiliated from across the room, decided it was time to intervene and reassert her dominance. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as she marched over to the center of the ballroom. She grabbed a microphone from the bandstand and tapped it loudly, forcing everyone's attention away from Kyle and onto her. "Excuse me, everyone," Vanessa said, her voice echoing shrilly through the silent room. "Thank you all for coming to honor our father. As his sole heir and the new CEO of Harrison Logistics, I want to assure you that my husband and I are taking this company to unprecedented new heights. We are the future of this family's legacy, and we will not let anyone drag us down." She stared directly at me as she said the final words, expecting me to cause a scene or burst into tears. My aunts and uncles looked at me with varying expressions of pity and discomfort, but I did not give Vanessa the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply raised my glass of water in a silent, mocking toast, turned on my heel, and walked out the front doors of the ballroom. I had work to do, and Friday was coming. The crisp night air hit my face as I walked away from the hotel, leaving the sound of forced laughter and clinking glasses behind me. I did not shed a single tear on the drive back to my catering facility. Grief was a luxury I could not afford right now, and I had a 500-person corporate luncheon to prepare for by dawn. The massive stainless steel doors of my commercial kitchen swung shut behind me, blocking out the noise of the city and the stinging memory of my family's betrayal. This kitchen was my sanctuary. It was the only place where the rules made sense. You put in the hard work, you apply the heat, and you create something beautiful. By 6 in the morning, the facility was a chaotic symphony of sizzling grills, shouting chefs, and clattering pans. I was standing at the main prep table meticulously inspecting trays of roasted root vegetables, when the heavy double doors at the front of the kitchen violently swung open. The sudden noise made my sous chef drop his knife. I looked up to see my mother, Beverly, marching into my pristine workspace. She looked completely absurd and entirely out of place, wearing a black silk blouse and oversized sunglasses inside a brightly lit industrial kitchen. Her jaw was set tight, and she sidestepped a rolling cart of fresh produce with a look of absolute disgust. She had come to punish me for walking out of the repast last night. "You embarrassed us, Chloe," she snapped, not even bothering to offer a greeting. She stopped a few feet away from my prep table, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "Kyle was trying to secure vital seed money from those investors, and you made a public spectacle of yourself. Walking out of your own father's memorial, refusing to help your sister when she needed you the most." I set my clipboard down on the stainless steel counter. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a slow, deep breath, and looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent my entire life placing me second. "I did not make a spectacle, Mom," I said, my voice steady enough to cut through the ambient noise of the kitchen. "I simply refused to be the punchline to Kyle's jokes. And I refused to cater a networking event disguised as a funeral." Beverly scoffed, aggressively pulling off her sunglasses to glare at me. "It was a family event. You own a catering company. It was your duty to provide the food. Do you have any idea how much Vanessa had to pay that overpriced hotel vendor at the last minute because you decided to be petty and selfish? You should have done it for free out of respect for your father." The sheer audacity of her words struck a deep, ancient nerve. This was the exact dynamic that had suffocated me for 35 years. It was the darkest, most insidious version of the black tax. The unspoken but ironclad rule in our household was that my labor, my money, and my time were communal property, always available to subsidize my sister's extravagant lifestyle. "Respect for my father," I repeated, stepping around the table to close the distance between us. "My father respected hard work. He did not respect grifters. For my entire life, you have expected me to break my back so Vanessa could protect her manicure. When I was 19, working double shifts at the diner to pay for culinary school, you bought Vanessa a brand new Mercedes because taking the bus would ruin her aesthetic. When I spent my weekends building this business from scratch, you expected me to drop everything to plan Vanessa's elaborate wedding to a man who does not even have a steady job." Beverly's eyes flashed with defensive anger. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of your sister." "I am not jealous," I fired back, my voice rising just enough to make her take a half step back. "I am exhausted." I am exhausted from being the family mule while you treat her like a show pony. You never demanded that Vanessa work for free. You never expected her to sacrifice her comfort for my benefit. But the moment I refused to hand over $50,000 worth of premium catering to impress Kyle's tech bro friends, I am the villain. You do not view me as a daughter. You view me as an endless supply of free resources. You are acting completely unhinged, Beverly hissed, looking around nervously as a few of my kitchen staff subtly stopped working to listen. This is exactly why your father left the estate to Vanessa. She knows how to handle the family legacy. You are just a bitter, angry woman surrounded by pots and pans. You need to apologize to your sister and beg for her forgiveness before she cuts you out completely. Before I could deliver the sharp response burning on my tongue, the shrill ring of the emergency line in my private office echoed over the kitchen intercom. That specific line was only given to my top-tier clients and my financial institutions. I gave my mother one last cold look. "We have nothing else to discuss," I said, turning my back on her. "The exit is right behind you. Do not slip on the freshly mopped floors." I walked away, ignoring her indignant sputtering, and headed straight into my glass-walled office. I picked up the receiver of the ringing phone. It was Richard, the senior branch manager at my primary commercial bank. I had known him for 7 years, ever since I deposited my very first corporate check. "Chloe," Richard said, his voice unusually tense and formal. "I am calling as a courtesy. We just received a court-ordered injunction this morning. I am so sorry, but I have been legally forced to freeze all of your business operating accounts, effective immediately." The air in my office suddenly felt terribly thin. I sat down heavily in my leather chair, staring through the glass walls at my bustling kitchen. My staff was prepping food for a massive client. Payroll was due on Friday. Vendor invoices were set to automatically draft at midnight. "Frozen," I repeated, my mind racing to process the information. "Richard, what are you talking about? My accounts are in perfect standing. I have 0 outstanding debt." "The injunction was filed by your father's estate," Richard explained softly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Specifically, by Vanessa and Kyle Harrison. They filed a sworn affidavit claiming that the initial capital used to launch your catering business was derived from your father's personal funds. Under the current probate filings, they are claiming your LLC is a subsidiary of the Harrison estate. Until the legal dispute is resolved, you cannot withdraw, transfer, or spend a single dime." A cold, dark realization washed over me. They were not just satisfied with taking the family mansion and the $50 million trust. They wanted to destroy the only thing I had built for myself. They wanted to strip away my independence so I would be forced to crawl back to them on my hands and knees. They wanted to starve me out. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "My father never gave me a dime of startup capital. 10 years ago, he simply co-signed a small business loan, a loan that I paid off in full, 5 years ahead of schedule. I have the original discharge papers stamped by your very bank. This injunction is entirely fraudulent." "I believe you, Chloe," Richard replied sympathetically. "But my hands are tied by the court order. You need to get your lawyer to file an emergency motion to lift the freeze. If you do not resolve this quickly, the automated checks you wrote for your produce suppliers are going to bounce by tomorrow morning." I hung up the phone. For a brief moment, the overwhelming weight of the sabotage threatened to crush me. Kyle and Vanessa had planned this perfectly. They waited until the morning of my biggest corporate event of the month to cut off my financial lifeblood. They expected me to panic. They expected me to fall apart. Suddenly, a loud commotion outside my office caught my attention. I looked through the glass and saw Jamal, my head chef, aggressively blocking the kitchen entrance. Standing in the doorway, wearing a smug, triumphant grin and a tailored suit he definitely could not afford, was Kyle. He was waving a thick stack of legal documents in the air, trying to push past my staff. I stood up from my desk. I smoothed down the front of my apron. The grief over my father was suddenly replaced by a pure, unadulterated fire. They wanted a war over the family legacy. They had no idea they just picked a fight with the only person in the family who actually knew how to fight. I pushed open the heavy glass door of my office and stepped out into the chaotic energy of the main prep area. Jamal, my head chef, was standing firm, his massive frame completely blocking Kyle from stepping any further into our sanitized workspace. Kyle was practically vibrating with unearned arrogance, aggressively waving a thick stack of stapled legal papers in Jamal's face. "Stand down, Jamal," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the hum of the industrial refrigerators. Jamal shot Kyle a look of pure disgust before stepping aside. Kyle immediately strutted into the center of my kitchen like a conqueror claiming new territory. He was wearing a ridiculously tight-tailored suit that he undoubtedly bought using my father's credit lines. He looked around at the gleaming stainless steel prep tables, the massive commercial ovens, and my team of highly trained culinary professionals who had paused their work to watch the spectacle. "Well, well," Kyle sneered, trailing a finger along the edge of a spotless counter and inspecting his fingertip for dust. Finding none, he wiped his hand on his pants anyway. "I have to admit, Chloe, this is a very elaborate setup for a cute little kitchen hobby, but the playtime is officially over." I crossed my arms and stood my ground. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain why you are trespassing in a private commercial facility before I have security escort you to the curb." Kyle let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He slapped the stack of legal papers onto the nearest prep table, right next to a tray of freshly sliced heirloom tomatoes. "I am not trespassing. My wife and I just filed a court-ordered injunction against this entire operation. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your assets are locked. According to the estate probate, this little catering experiment was funded by Harrison money, which makes it Harrison property. And since Vanessa is the sole heir, that makes me your new boss." He leaned forward, planting both hands on the table, invading my space. "You really thought you could just disrespect Vanessa and ignore our authority. Now look at you, bankrupt in a day. But I am a generous guy, Chloe. Once we liquidate this equipment, I am still going to need someone to run the coffee cart at my new tech headquarters. I can offer you a minimum wage spot. It is honest work for someone in your desperate position." My kitchen staff exchanged nervous glances. They knew the margins in the restaurant industry were razor thin. A frozen bank account was usually a death sentence for a business our size. They were waiting to see if I would crumble under the pressure. I did not crumble. I did not even blink. I calmly reached past Kyle, picked up a perfectly baked slice of pound cake from the tasting rack, and took a slow, deliberate bite. "Are you deaf?" Kyle snapped, his face flushing with anger at my complete lack of panic. "I just told you that I own you. You own absolutely nothing, Kyle," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I swallowed the cake and wiped my hands on a crisp linen towel. "You are waving around a baseless injunction based on a fraudulent affidavit. My father did not fund this business. He co-signed a small business loan 10 years ago, a loan that I paid off completely, with interest, 5 years ahead of schedule." Kyle scoffed, though his eyes darted nervously for a fraction of a second. "You are lying. We reviewed the estate ledgers. You reviewed what you wanted to see," I corrected him. I walked back into my glass-walled office, leaving the door wide open. I moved to the heavy steel safe bolted beneath my desk. I dialed the combination, pulled the heavy lever, and retrieved a thick, heavily stamped manila envelope. I walked back out to the prep floor and dropped the envelope directly on top of his fake cease and desist papers. "Open it," I commanded. Kyle hesitated, his smug expression faltering. He snatched the envelope and ripped it open. He pulled out the original loan discharge documents, heavily embossed by the very bank that had just frozen my accounts. Attached to the back was the official Articles of Organization for my LLC, clearly stating that Chloe Harrison was the 100% sole equity owner of the business. My father's name was nowhere on the ownership documents. My lawyer has already filed an emergency motion to quash your ridiculous injunction, I told him, stepping closer so he could see the absolute resolve in my eyes. The freeze will be lifted by the end of the business day. And when it is, my legal team will be filing a countersuit against you and Vanessa for tortious interference with a business contract. I watched the color completely drain from Kyle's face. He stared at the discharge papers as if the ink were written in an alien language. You really thought you could stroll into my kitchen and intimidate me? I continued, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. Let me remind you of something, Kyle. This hobby of mine catered the mayor's gala last week. The exact same gala you could not even afford a charity ticket for. This business generates more legitimate revenue in a single quarter than all of your failed tech startups combined. You are playing out of your league. The surrounding kitchen staff let out a collective murmur of approval. Jamal crossed his massive arms and smiled. Kyle turned a deep, blotchy shade of red. The public humiliation was absolute. He had come here expecting me to cry and beg for access to my own money. Instead, I had systematically dismantled his entire power play in front of my employees. He aggressively shoved the documents back onto the table. His hands were shaking slightly. He realized instantly that his grand plan to starve me out financially had completely backfired, leaving him exposed to a massive lawsuit he could not possibly afford to fight. Kyle pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb aggressively stabbing at the screen as he dialed. He pressed the phone to his ear, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was signaling Vanessa. Their quick, dirty attempt to ruin me had failed, and now they needed a new strategy to retaliate. Vanessa, Kyle barked into the phone the second she answered, turning his back to me and pacing toward the exit. We have a problem. She has the discharge papers. The bank freeze is not going to hold. I followed him to the double doors, Jamal right on my heels. Tell my sister I will see her on Friday, I said loudly, ensuring Vanessa could hear me through the phone connection. And Kyle. He stopped in the doorway, shooting me a venomous look over his shoulder. Do not ever step foot in my kitchen again, I warned him. Jamal, please show our guest out, and if he resists, feel free to use the service alley. Jamal took a heavy step forward. Kyle did not wait around to test the threat. He shoved the door open and practically sprinted to his illegally parked luxury car. I watched through the reinforced glass as he sped out of the parking lot, his phone still glued to his ear. The moment his car disappeared down the street, the tension in the kitchen shattered. My staff immediately went back to work, the rhythmic sound of chopping and sizzling returning to normal. I walked back to my prep table, picked up my clipboard, and took a deep breath. They were panicking now. The false confidence they had projected at the funeral and the repast was crumbling. Kyle and Vanessa thought they held all the cards because they lived in the mansion, but they were about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between inherited wealth and actual power. Friday was the official reading of my father's will, and I knew for a fact that the red folder sitting in my car was going to completely destroy their fragile, stolen empire. Let them scheme. Let them try to retaliate. I was more than ready. It was finally Friday morning, the day that would either cement my family's delusion or completely tear it down. The sky over the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue, completely at odds with the heavy, suffocating drama I was about to walk into. I parked my SUV in the underground garage of the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed Mr. Sterling's elite law firm. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet luxury of my car for a moment, letting the silence settle over me. Then, I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the thick red folder. The heavy cardstock felt like a shield in my hands. It contained the absolute truth, completely immune to my mother's gaslighting and my sister's relentless greed. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The doors slid open silently, revealing an expansive reception area lined with rich mahogany paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city skyline. It was an office built on power, intimidation, and ironclad contracts. My father had spent countless hours in these halls, building his logistics empire from a single delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar behemoth. As I walked across the plush carpet toward the main conference suite, I could already hear the sound of Vanessa's shrill, theatrical laughter echoing down the corridor. Mr. Sterling had reserved the firm's largest executive lounge for our family. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors, I was genuinely appalled, though not entirely surprised, by the scene inside. Vanessa had somehow managed to turn the somber occasion of our father's final will reading into a grotesque victory party. She was wearing a blindingly white designer dress, looking more like she was attending a summer gala than mourning the patriarch of our family. My mother, Beverly, was sitting in a leather armchair by the window, casually flipping through a luxury travel magazine, completely unbothered by the gravity of the day. Several of my extended family members were also there. Aunt Shirley and Uncle David sat quietly on a nearby sofa. My father had always provided for his siblings, and they were likely present to hear about the small stipends he had set aside for them. But the person who caught my attention the most was Kyle. Unlike his usual arrogant self, Kyle was standing near the back of the room, looking remarkably tense. Ever since I had humiliated him and his fake cease and desist letters in my commercial kitchen 2 days ago, he had seemingly lost his bravado. He kept checking his phone, his face pale, avoiding my gaze entirely as I walked into the room. Vanessa, however, was completely oblivious to her husband's sudden onset of anxiety. She was entirely drunk on her own perceived power. As soon as she saw me enter, Vanessa's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She walked over to a silver service cart in the corner of the room, where she had actually brought her own bottle of expensive champagne. She poured a generous glass, picked up a silver spoon, and loudly clinked the crystal. "Attention, everyone," Vanessa announced, her voice ringing out through the quiet lounge. The idle chatter immediately stopped. My aunts and uncles looked up, clearly uncomfortable with the celebratory tone she was setting. Vanessa stepped into the center of the room, holding her champagne glass high. "Since we are all gathered here today, I want to take this opportunity to make a formal announcement before we deal with the tedious legal paperwork. As you all know, my father built Harrison Logistics from the ground up. He was a visionary, and before he passed, he made it very clear who he trusted to carry on that vision." She paused dramatically, making sure every eye in the room was fixed on her. "Therefore, I am incredibly proud to officially declare myself the sole heir of the Harrison estate and the new Chief Executive Officer of the Harrison Logistics Empire. Kyle and I have already begun restructuring the executive board to modernize the company. We are taking this family into a new era of wealth and prestige." The absolute audacity of her speech hung in the air like a foul odor. She was entirely rewriting the family narrative right in front of me. For years, she had never shown a single ounce of interest in the business. She did not know the difference between a freight invoice and a bill of lading. She had never stepped foot in one of my father's warehouses, claiming the smell of diesel fuel made her nauseous. I was the one who had spent my teenage years organizing his dispatch files. I was the one who understood profit margins and vendor negotiations. Yet here she was, erasing my existence and my contributions with a single sip of champagne. The silence in the room was deafening. No one clapped, no one cheered. Aunt Shirley looked down at her hands. Her shoulders slumped. Uncle David let out a long, heavy sigh. They all turned to look at me, their faces painted with profound pity. They had watched me work myself to the bone for years, building my own successful catering business while constantly being overshadowed by Vanessa's demands. In their eyes, I was the tragic, forgotten daughter, the loyal workhorse who had been cruelly put out to pasture while the spoiled show pony inherited the entire farm. I could feel the weight of their sympathetic stares. It is a terrible thing to be pitied by your own family. It makes you feel small, insignificant, and entirely powerless. Aunt Shirley actually stood up and took a hesitant step toward me. She reached out and gently patted my arm. "I am so sorry, Chloe," Aunt Shirley whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "We all know how much your father loved you. We know how hard you have worked. This just does not seem right." I gently placed my hand over Aunt Shirley's and gave it a reassuring squeeze, but I did not say a word to her. I did not need comfort because I was not a victim. I looked past my aunt and locked eyes with Vanessa. She was staring right back at me, her chin tilted up in defiance. She was waiting for the explosion. She expected me to finally snap, to cause a massive scene in front of the extended family. She wanted me to scream about how unfair it all was. She wanted me to cry and beg for a minor position on her newly formed executive board. She desperately needed me to validate her power by fighting her for it. If I begged, it would prove that she was the superior sister, the ultimate winner of my mother's toxic, decades-long competition. I felt a calm, icy wave of control wash over me. I slowly walked over to the beverage cart. I ignored the champagne and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I turned back around to face the room. Every single person was holding their breath, waiting for the screaming match to begin. Kyle actually took a step backward toward the exit, clearly remembering how brutally I had dismantled him in my kitchen. I looked directly at my sister. I raised my glass of sparkling water high in the air, mimicking her exact posture. Then, I offered her a wide, blindingly bright, and entirely genuine smile. "Congratulations, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and completely empty of any anger or resentment. "To your grand inheritance. May you get exactly what you deserve." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I set the glass down gently on the silver tray. Without breaking eye contact, I gave her one final, chilling smile. Then, I simply turned on my heel and walked right past her. I bypassed the stunned faces of my mother and my relatives, pushed open the massive double oak doors leading into Mr. Sterling's private inner conference room, and walked inside. I did not need to argue with her. I did not need to defend my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. The heavy red folder tucked securely under my arm felt warm against my side. Vanessa thought she was the new queen of the empire, but she had absolutely no idea that she was standing on a throne made of quicksand. I took a seat at the far end of the massive mahogany table, set the red folder down in front of me, and waited for the lawyer to arrive. The delusion was about to end. The air in my commercial kitchen was thick with the rich, savory scent of roasted garlic and searing Wagyu beef. It had been 2 days since I walked out of that disastrous family repast, and I had buried myself entirely in my work. That was how I coped. While my sister Vanessa was busy playing corporate dress-up and planning how to spend our father's millions, I was on my feet at 5 in the morning, managing a team of 20 culinary professionals. We were in the final crucial stages of prepping for a massive 500-person corporate gala for one of the city's top tech firms. This was the kind of high-stakes contract that could secure my company's financial future for the next 2 years. I was standing at the stainless steel prep island, meticulously reviewing the plating diagrams with my head chef, Jamal, when the red emergency line in my glass-walled office began to flash. That specific phone line was strictly reserved for my top-tier clients and my primary financial institutions. I wiped my hands on a crisp white towel, told Jamal to keep an eye on the reduction sauce, and walked into my office. I picked up the receiver, expecting a last-minute dietary request from the event coordinator. Instead, I heard the strained, incredibly uncomfortable voice of Richard, the senior branch manager at my commercial bank. I had known Richard for nearly a decade. He was the man who had helped me set up my very first business checking account when I was just starting out. "Chloe," Richard began, his tone uncharacteristically formal and tense. "I am calling you as a professional courtesy before the automated notices go out. I am so sorry, but I have been legally compelled to freeze all of your business operating accounts, effective immediately. The ambient noise of my bustling kitchen seemed to completely drop away. I sat down heavily in the leather chair behind my desk, my eyes fixed on the piles of vendor invoices waiting to be paid. Frozen, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, tight whisper. Richard, what are you talking about? My accounts are in perfect standing. We just deposited a massive retainer from the tech firm yesterday. I have zero outstanding debts. I know, Chloe. Richard sighed heavily. But my hands are completely tied. We were served with an emergency court-ordered injunction this morning. It was filed by the executors of your father's estate, specifically by Vanessa and Kyle Harrison. A cold, sharp spike of absolute fury pierced through my chest. They filed a sworn affidavit with the probate court, Richard continued, sounding genuinely apologetic. They are legally claiming that the initial startup capital used to launch your catering business was derived entirely from your father's personal funds. Because the estate is currently in probate, they are claiming your limited liability company is actually a subsidiary asset of the Harrison estate. Until this legal dispute is resolved by a judge, you cannot withdraw, transfer, or spend a single dime. I stared through the glass walls of my office at my staff. They were moving flawlessly, a well-oiled machine of pure culinary talent. Tomorrow morning, I needed to process a $50,000 payroll run. By tomorrow afternoon, I had to pay my specialty seafood vendors for the hundreds of lobster tails arriving for the gala. If those funds were not released, the vendors would hold the delivery. If the delivery was held, I would default on my contract with the tech firm. My reputation, built over 10 grueling years of flawless service, would be completely destroyed in a matter of hours. This was their strategy. Kyle and Vanessa knew they could not intimidate me emotionally, so they decided to starve me out financially. They wanted to paralyze my life's work, so I would be forced to crawl back to the family mansion on my hands and knees, begging for access to my own money. They wanted me compliant. They wanted me broken. Richard, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, leaning forward and pressing my elbows onto the desk. Every word in that affidavit is a complete and utter lie. My father never gave me a single dime of startup capital. He did not hand me a check. He did not transfer funds into my account. I believe you, Chloe, but the court order is binding until you prove otherwise, Richard replied softly. 10 years ago, I continued, my voice vibrating with controlled anger as the memories flooded back. When I was 25 years old and working 3 different restaurant jobs, I brought my father a 50-page business plan. I asked him for a loan. He refused. He told me that if I wanted to build an empire, I had to carry the weight of the risk myself. So he did not give me his money. He simply co-signed a small business loan to help me secure a better interest rate. That was it. Just a signature. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering the grueling years that followed. While my mother was buying Vanessa brand new luxury cars and funding her lavish vacations to Europe, I was working 18-hour shifts. I slept on a cot in the back of my first tiny commercial kitchen. I poured every single dollar of profit right back into the business. I paid that loan off in full, Richard, I stated firmly, opening my eyes and glaring at the wall as if Kyle were standing right in front of me. I paid it off with interest, 5 years ahead of schedule. I assumed all the risk, I did all the labor, and I own 100% of the equity in this company. My father's name is nowhere on my current operating licenses or my ownership documents. If you have the original discharge papers proving the loan was settled and his financial interest was terminated, you need to get them to your lawyer immediately, Richard advised. If your legal team files an emergency motion to quash their injunction, a judge might lift the freeze before the end of the business day. But Chloe, if those automated vendor checks bounce tonight, your accounts will be flagged for fraud. You are running out of time. I thanked Richard for the warning and hung up the phone. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion designed for people who do not know how to fight back. I stood up, walked over to the heavy steel safe bolted beneath my desk, and quickly dialed the combination. The heavy metal door swung open. I reached past the petty cash boxes and pulled out a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. Inside were the original, notarized loan discharge documents, heavily embossed by the very bank that had just frozen my accounts. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of my independence. Vanessa and Kyle had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was as careless with paperwork as they were. They assumed that because I was the family's scapegoat, I would simply roll over and accept their financial abuse just to keep the peace. But I was done keeping the peace for people who were constantly waging war against me. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed Mr. Sterling's direct office line. As it rang, I looked out into my kitchen. My staff was depending on me. My clients were depending on me. I had built this sanctuary with my own 2 hands, and I would burn the entire Harrison estate to the ground before I let my spoiled sister and her parasitic husband take credit for my sweat. I slipped the discharge papers into a red folder, completely unaware that the real confrontation was about to walk right through my front door. The phone rang just as I was slipping the discharge papers into the red folder. It was Mr. Sterling's assistant confirming my appointment for Friday. I hung up the receiver, took a deep breath, and prepared to head back out to the prep floor. But before my hand could even touch the glass door of my office, the heavy steel double doors at the front entrance of my commercial kitchen burst open. The loud, violent bang of metal against the wall echoed over the hissing grills and the hum of the industrial refrigerators. Every single chef, prep cook, and dishwasher froze. I stepped out of my office and looked across the room. Marching through my doors, wearing a smug, triumphant grin and a tailored suit he had absolutely no business wearing in a commercial kitchen, was Kyle. He was holding a thick stack of stapled papers in his right hand, waving them around like a royal decree. He did not even look at me first. Instead, he strutted directly into the center of my meticulously sanitized prep area, his expensive leather shoes leaving scuff marks on my freshly mopped floors. "Listen up, everybody," Kyle shouted, clapping his hands together to demand the attention of my highly trained culinary team. "Put down your knives. Turn off the ovens. As of 8 o'clock this morning, this entire facility is under new management. I am your new boss, and I am officially shutting down operations for the day." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the kitchen. My head chef, Jamal, who was a towering man with a decade of elite culinary experience, stood frozen with a massive chef knife in his hand. He looked from Kyle to me, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to pure, unadulterated hostility. I did not rush forward. I did not yell. I walked slowly and deliberately from my office to the center of the kitchen, stopping just a few feet away from my brother-in-law. The sheer audacity of this man, a failed tech bro who had never worked a single day of physical labor in his entire life, walking into my sanctuary and barking orders at my staff, was staggering. "Kyle," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly measured, "you have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you just barged into a restricted health department regulated commercial kitchen without a hairnet, or I am having Jamal physically throw you into the alley with the grease traps." Kyle let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He puffed out his chest and shoved the stack of stapled papers directly into my face. He thought he had the ultimate upper hand. He thought the frozen bank accounts had already broken my spirit, and he was here to deliver the final killing blow. "I do not need a hairnet to walk into my own building, Chloe," Kyle sneered, his face flushed with unearned arrogance. He tapped the top page of the document aggressively. "This is a formal cease and desist order. Your bank accounts are officially frozen, which means you cannot pay the lease on this building, you cannot pay these workers, and you cannot afford the food you are currently cooking. Vanessa and I are the executors of the Harrison estate. This catering company was built on Harrison money, which makes it Harrison property." I glanced down at the paper he was waving. It was a joke. It was not signed by a judge. It did not have an official court seal. It looked like a generic legal template he had downloaded from the internet and printed at a local copy shop. He was trying to bluff his way into taking physical possession of my multi-million-dollar business. "You are trespassing, Kyle," I replied, keeping my hands clasped loosely in front of my apron. "That piece of paper is completely worthless, and you know it." "It is going to be worth a lot when the police get here," Kyle threatened, his voice rising in pitch as he realized I was not instantly cowering in fear. He pulled his shiny new smartphone out of his pocket and held it up like a weapon. "You are unlawfully occupying my wife's property. If you do not go into that office right now, hand over the master keys to this facility, and pack your bags, I am dialing 911. I will have you arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage." He then turned back to my kitchen staff, trying to weaponize their fear against me. "And that goes for the rest of you," Kyle barked, pointing his finger at my prep cooks. "Anyone who continues to work for this woman is aiding and abetting a criminal. If you want to keep your jobs when I restructure this company tomorrow, you will drop what you are doing and step away from the equipment right now." My staff exchanged nervous glances. They were hard-working people. They had families to feed, rent to pay, and lives to maintain. They knew the restaurant industry was ruthless, and a frozen bank account was usually a death sentence for a business. They were looking at me, waiting to see if the empire I had built was actually crumbling beneath their feet. Kyle smirked, seeing their hesitation. He thought he had completely isolated me. He thought he had successfully stripped away my authority in the very room where I had earned it with blood, sweat, and third-degree burns. This was the ultimate gentrification of my life's work. A mediocre white man walking into a space built by a black woman, waving a fake legal document, and demanding the keys to the kingdom. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the rich scent of the kitchen fill my lungs. I looked at Jamal. He was gripping his knife tightly, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for the command. "Jamal," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the thick tension in the room. "Yes, chef," Jamal answered immediately, his posture straightening. "The Wagyu beef needs to rest for exactly 10 minutes before carving," I instructed, speaking to him as if Kyle were nothing more than a minor health code violation we needed to sweep up later. "And the shallots for the reduction sauce are going to burn if they sit there any longer. Keep chopping those onions, nobody stops working. We have a 500-person gala to feed, and we do not pause our prep for uninvited guests." Jamal's face broke into a massive, relieved grin. "You heard her," Jamal roared to the rest of the kitchen, his booming voice completely drowning out Kyle's presence. "Back to work. Let's move." Instantly, the kitchen sprang back to life. The rhythmic sound of knives hitting cutting boards, the violent sizzle of meat hitting hot oil, and the sharp communication between the cooks resumed at full volume. My staff completely ignored Kyle. They moved around him as if he were an annoying piece of furniture blocking their path. Kyle's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, frantic outrage. He could not comprehend how I had just dismissed him. He was holding a piece of paper that he thought made him a king, but in my kitchen, he was absolutely nothing. "Are you insane?" Kyle screamed over the noise of the exhaust hoods, taking a step toward me. His face was turning a deep, blotchy shade of red. "I just told you I am calling the cops. You are going to leave this building in handcuffs, Chloe. Give me the master keys right now." "Call them," I said, smiling at him for the very first time since my father's funeral. "Please, Kyle, call the police. Have them send a squad car. Have them send two." Kyle hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen of his phone. He had expected me to panic. He had expected me to beg him not to call the authorities. He did not know what to do with a woman who invited the confrontation. "While you do that," I continued, turning my back on him completely, "I am going to get something to show the officers when they arrive." I walked away from him, my heavy work shoes clicking steadily against the tile floor. I ignored his angry sputtering and headed straight back toward my glass-walled office. I pushed the door open and walked directly toward the heavy steel safe bolted beneath my desk. Kyle had overplayed his hand, and he was about to learn a brutal, irreversible lesson about what happens when you try to steal from a woman who built her empire from the ground up. The cold metal of the safe handle felt grounding under my fingertips. I reached past the locked cash boxes and pulled out the thick, fireproof manila envelope. This was it. The culmination of a decade of sleepless nights, burned hands, and missed holidays. I did not just build a business. I built an ironclad fortress around my livelihood, specifically because I knew the people in my family could never be trusted. I walked back out onto the main prep floor. Kyle was still standing exactly where I left him, though his bravado was beginning to visibly fracture. His phone was still in his hand, the screen glowing, but he had not dialed the police. Bullies like Kyle rely entirely on intimidation. When you do not flinch, they do not know how to execute their own threats. "Did you call them?" I asked loudly, my voice echoing off the stainless steel hoods. I walked right up to him, closing the distance until we were only a few feet apart. "Are the police on their way, Kyle? Because I would really hate for them to miss this." Kyle sneered, pocketing his phone with a jerky defensive motion. "I am giving you one last chance to do this the easy way, Chloe. Hand over the keys, pack your personal items, and walk away. If you make me bring the authorities into this, I will make sure the estate presses maximum charges against you." I did not respond with words. Instead, I lifted the heavy envelope and forcefully slapped it down onto the stainless steel prep table, right on top of his printed, worthless cease and desist letter. The loud smack made Kyle physically jump. I untied the string closure and pulled out the original loan discharge documents. "Read it," I commanded, tapping my index finger directly onto the heavily embossed gold seal of the commercial bank. Kyle stared at me for a second, his jaw tight, before his eyes darted down to the paperwork. I watched him try to maintain his arrogant posture, but as his eyes scanned the legal text, I saw the exact moment his entire delusion shattered. He read the final loan balance, $0.00. He read the date of the final payment, which was 5 years ago. And then, he read the attached articles of organization for my limited liability company. "As you can see," I said, my voice dripping with absolute freezing contempt, "Chloe Harrison is listed as the sole 100% equity owner of this corporation. There are no silent partners. There are no investors. And most importantly, my father's name is completely absent from every single legally binding document associated with this facility." Kyle swallowed hard. The blotchy red color on his face rapidly drained, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "This is a forgery," he stammered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He weakly poked at the paper. "You printed this yourself. The estate ledgers clearly show that your father funded this. The estate ledgers show that my father co-signed a loan, which I paid off entirely by myself," I interrupted sharply. "My lawyer has already filed an emergency motion with the probate judge, attaching these exact certified documents. Your fraudulent injunction is going to be lifted before the afternoon is over, and when it is, my legal team will be coming after you and Vanessa for tortious interference, defamation, and attempting to file a false legal claim." Kyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the kitchen, suddenly hyper-aware of the 20 culinary professionals who were watching him completely unravel. Jamal, my head chef, was leaning against a prep counter, openly smirking at him. I looked up toward the front entrance and caught the eye of Elijah, the massive, no-nonsense retired police officer who ran security for my building. I gave him a subtle nod. Elijah immediately pushed off the wall and began walking toward us, his heavy boots thudding against the floor tiles. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my kitchen, Kyle," I said, leaning closer so he could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. "If you are still standing on my property when that clock runs out, Elijah is going to physically throw you into the alley." Kyle's eyes darted toward the approaching security guard. Panic finally broke through his tailored facade. "You cannot do this to me," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. I am family. I am the executor of the estate. You are a parasite, I corrected him, my tone flat and final. And you have 15 seconds. Kyle tried to snatch his fake cease and desist papers off the table, but in his panicked haste, his elbow clipped a tray of freshly sliced heirloom tomatoes. The heavy metal tray clattered onto the floor. Red juice and wet seeds splattered across the toes of his expensive leather shoes. He let out a loud curse, stepping back and frantically trying to wipe his shoe on the back of his pant leg. "Time is up," I announced. Elijah arrived. He did not ask Kyle politely to leave. He did not issue a verbal warning. Elijah reached out with one massive hand and clamped it firmly onto the shoulder of Kyle's expensive suit jacket. With a single, powerful yank, he spun Kyle around and started marching him backward toward the heavy metal rear exit doors. "Get your hands off me!" Kyle shrieked, his voice cracking as he wildly flailed his arms. He tried to plant his feet, but his expensive leather soles slipped entirely on the tomato juice, making him look completely ridiculous. Elijah did not break stride. He dragged my brother-in-law through the kitchen like a misbehaving toddler. My kitchen staff erupted into cheers. Someone actually started a slow clap. The humiliation was absolute. Kyle was being physically ejected from the space he had just tried to conquer, and everyone was watching him fail. Elijah hit the push bar on the rear emergency exit. The heavy metal door swung open, revealing the damp, concrete service alley lined with massive industrial dumpsters. Elijah shoved Kyle backward, sending him stumbling out into the humid afternoon air. Kyle lost his balance and fell hard onto the wet asphalt, scraping his hands and ruining the knees of his tailored suit pants. I walked slowly to the open doorway, looking down at him as he scrambled to his feet. His suit was covered in street grime, his hair was disheveled, and his face was contorted with pure, helpless rage. "You think you have won, Chloe!" Kyle screamed, pointing a dirty, scraped finger at me from the middle of the alley. "You think these little papers are going to save you. Just wait until Friday. Just wait until the official reading." I stood silently in the doorway, letting him tire himself out like a child throwing a tantrum. "Vanessa and I are going to take everything," he continued to yell, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the alley. "We are going to strip you of every last dime. Come Friday, we are going to strip you of your last name. You will be nothing. You hear me? Nothing." I looked at this pathetic, desperate man trying to claim my family's legacy. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt completely ready for the war ahead. "I will see you on Friday, Kyle," I said calmly. "Do not be late." I reached out, grabbed the heavy metal handle of the service door, and pulled it shut. The solid click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence of the locked door wash over me. Then, I turned around to face my kitchen. Every single member of my staff was standing silently, watching me. They had just witnessed the ugly, toxic reality of my family dynamic spill out onto their prep floor. But they had also seen me fiercely defend our sanctuary. I smoothed down the front of my apron. I walked over to the prep table, picked up the scattered, worthless legal papers Kyle had left behind, and tossed them directly into the nearest trash can. "All right, everyone," I called out, my voice steady and commanding. "The show is over. Jamal, get a mop for those tomatoes. We have a 500-person gala in 4 hours, and I want those Wagyu steaks resting perfectly. Let us get back to work." The kitchen instantly roared back to life. Knives hit cutting boards, pans clattered onto the hot stoves, and the beautiful, chaotic rhythm of my empire resumed. Kyle and Vanessa thought they could break me before Friday. They thought they could strip away my power. But as I walked back to my office to properly file my discharge papers, I knew the absolute truth. Friday was not going to be my execution. It was going to be theirs. The morning of the official reading arrived with a cold, biting wind that whipped through the city streets. I pulled my SUV into the underground parking garage of the towering glass and steel building that housed Mr. Sterling's elite law firm. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet luxury of my car for a long moment. My hands rested heavily on the steering wheel, my heart beating in a steady, measured rhythm. On the passenger seat next to me was the thick red folder. It was no longer just a collection of bank documents and ownership papers. It was a loaded weapon, and I was about to walk into a room full of people who had no idea they were standing directly in the line of fire. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The polished metal doors slid open silently to reveal an expansive reception area lined with rich, dark mahogany paneling and modern art. It was an intimidating, sterile space designed entirely to make people feel small and compliant. But I walked through the double glass doors with my shoulders back and my head held high. The receptionist directed me to the firm's private executive waiting room. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sheer, unapologetic audacity of my family was on full display. Vanessa was lounging across a sleek leather sofa, dressed in head-to-toe designer funeral couture. She was wearing a tailored black dress that clung tightly to her frame, and an oversized, dramatic black hat with a veil that looked like it belonged on a runway in Milan, not at a legal proceeding. She looked like a caricature of a grieving widow, despite the fact that she was the daughter. Kyle was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, aggressively tapping his foot. He was wearing a brand-new, sharply tailored suit, undoubtedly purchased to replace the one he had completely ruined when my security guard threw him into the wet alleyway yesterday afternoon. He refused to make eye contact with me as I walked in. His jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. He was radiating a nervous, volatile energy, but he stayed quiet, clearly instructed by Vanessa to let her do the talking today. And then, there was my mother, Beverly. She was sitting in a plush armchair in the corner of the room, completely ignoring the solemn gravity of the day. She had a glossy travel catalog spread wide open on her lap, and she was actively circling luxury European Mediterranean cruises with a gold fountain pen. She was literally planning her extravagant vacations before the ink on my father's death certificate was even fully dry. "Well, look who decided to show up," Vanessa drawled, adjusting her ridiculous hat and offering me a chilling, triumphant smile. "I am honestly surprised you could afford the parking validation downstairs, Chloe. With your little catering business completely frozen and shut down, I figured you would be standing in an unemployment line this morning. Do you need Kyle to give you bus fare to get back to your apartment?" I did not take the bait. I did not raise my voice, and I did not bother to inform her that my legal team had already successfully lifted their fraudulent bank freeze late last night. I simply walked over to the opposite side of the waiting room, took a seat in a high-backed leather chair, and placed the red folder gently on my lap. I crossed my legs, smoothed down my skirt, and looked at her with a calm, pitying expression. "Ignore her, Vanessa," Beverly chimed in, not even bothering to look up from her cruise catalog. "She is just here to beg Mr. Sterling for a handout. She knows she pushed us too far at the repast, and now she wants to apologize. Let her waste her time. We have a corporate board meeting to schedule this afternoon." As their toxic, arrogant voices faded into the background noise of the office, my mind drifted away from the waiting room. I closed my eyes for a brief second, transporting myself back to the sterile, brightly lit room of my father's hospital suite just 3 weeks ago. The cancer had moved through his body with brutal, terrifying efficiency, stripping away his physical strength and hollowing out his cheeks. But right up until the very end, his mind had remained as sharp as a finely honed blade. I had spent every single night sleeping in the uncomfortable, stiff vinyl chair next to his hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical beeping of his heart monitor. Vanessa and Beverly only ever visited the hospital during the day, specifically when the senior doctors made their rounds, ensuring they were seen playing the roles of the tragic, devoted family members. They never stayed to hold his hand when the pain medication wore off. But in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, when the cameras were off and the nurses left us alone, my father and I had the conversations that truly mattered. I remembered him reaching out with a frail, trembling hand, his skin bruised purple from the constant intravenous lines. He had gripped my wrist with a surprising amount of desperate, lingering strength. "They do not understand the weight of the crown, Chloe," he had whispered to me, his voice raspy and dry from the oxygen tubes. Your mother thinks wealth is a magic trick that just happens. Vanessa thinks it is a designer accessory. And that husband of hers. My father had paused, a deep, heavy look of absolute disgust crossing his tired face as he stared up at the ceiling tiles. Kyle is a parasite, my father had stated firmly. 3 months ago, that boy came into my office and tried to pitch me some ridiculous cryptocurrency scheme. He wanted me to hand over $5 million of the company's liquid capital so he could play pretend on the internet. I laughed him out of the room. But he is circling, Chloe. He is circling like a vulture, just waiting for me to stop breathing so he can sink his claws into everything I have built. I built this empire with my own 2 hands. I bled for it. I will not let a mediocre man tear it down to fund his own ego. He had made me promise him, right there in the dim, artificial light of the intensive care unit. He told me about the secret meetings he had been holding with Mr. Sterling over the past 3 years. He told me about the complex legal firewalls he was quietly building behind the scenes to protect his life's work. I am leaving the shiny things to Vanessa, he had said, a sad, deeply knowing smile touching his cracked lips. I am giving them the illusion of power, because shiny things are the only things those two respect. But the engine, Chloe, the engine that actually makes the money, that belongs to you. You are the only one in this family who knows what it means to actually work for a living. You are the only one who knows how to keep the engine running. Do not let them break you. A heavy set of double mahogany doors opening sharply snapped me out of my memories. Mr. Sterling's senior legal assistant, a tall, sharp-looking woman holding a thick leather binder, stepped into the waiting room. Mr. Sterling is ready for you all now, she announced, holding the heavy wooden doors open and gesturing toward the inner sanctuary of the firm. Vanessa immediately stood up, smoothing down the front of her expensive black dress and proudly linking her arm through Kyle's. Beverly snapped her cruise catalog shut, tucked it into her designer handbag, and stood up with a heavy sigh, acting as if collecting a $50 million inheritance was a tedious chore she just wanted to get over with. They walked right past me with their heads held high, completely convinced they were walking into a grand coronation. I stood up slowly. I brushed a piece of invisible lint off my shoulder. My grip tightened securely around the red folder. My father had given me the keys to the kingdom, and my sister had just spent the last 5 days trying to burn my house down. I took a deep breath, letting the calm, absolute certainty of the moment wash over me. I followed them into the massive, sunlit conference room. The waiting was finally over. The final act was about to begin. The massive mahogany table stretched across the center of the conference room, bathed in the bright morning light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Mr. Sterling was already seated at the head of the table. His demeanor was entirely professional and aggressively neutral. He wore a sharp gray suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, looking exactly like the kind of man who held the keys to a $50 million kingdom. Vanessa and Kyle immediately claimed the plush leather chairs directly to his right, positioning themselves as the undeniable heirs apparent. Beverly sat right next to Vanessa, delicately crossing her ankles and placing her expensive designer handbag directly onto the polished wood. Aunt Shirley and Uncle David took seats further down the table, looking incredibly uncomfortable with the celebratory energy my mother and sister were projecting. I walked to the very opposite end of the long table, pulled out a heavy chair, and sat down. I placed the thick red folder directly in front of me, keeping my hands resting lightly on top of it. Mr. Sterling opened his thick leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoed loudly in the silent room. He pulled out a massive stack of watermarked legal paper and set it squarely in the center of his leather desk pad. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his silver wire-rimmed reading glasses, and slid them onto his face. He cleared his throat, looked around the table to ensure he had everyone's attention, and began to read the formal preamble. He started by reading through my father's final wishes regarding his burial arrangements, which Vanessa had completely ignored in favor of her high society networking mixer. He then moved on to the minor financial stipends. He announced that Aunt Shirley and Uncle David were each receiving a trust fund of $500,000, designed specifically to ensure their comfortable retirement. My aunt let out a soft, shaking gasp, tears immediately welling in her eyes at her brother's incredible generosity. Even from the grave, my father was taking care of his people. Then, the energy in the room shifted. It grew impossibly quiet. Mr. Sterling turned a crisp white page, the sound practically magnified in the tense silence. "We will now address the primary corporate and real estate assets of the Harrison estate," Mr. Sterling announced, his voice steady, dry, and entirely devoid of emotion. Kyle leaned forward so fast his chair squeaked loudly against the hardwood floor. He was practically salivating, his eyes locked onto the stack of papers, as if he could magically read the text upside down. Vanessa vibrated in her seat, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an impatient, greedy rhythm against the edge of the mahogany table. Regarding the primary family residence located in the Fairfield Estates, valued at an appraised $8 million, Mr. Sterling read, his finger slowly tracing the lines of legal text. This property, along with all its physical contents, furnishings, and surrounding acreage, is hereby bequeathed in its entirety to my eldest daughter, Vanessa Harrison. Vanessa let out a sharp, high-pitched squeal of pure delight. She grabbed Kyle's arm and shook it excitedly. Kyle pumped his fist, mouthing the word yes under his breath. Mr. Sterling did not pause for their celebration. He did not look up. He simply continued reading the legally binding jargon, his voice a steady drumbeat of absolute authority. "Furthermore, I bequeath the entirety of the Harrison Logistics parent holding company, currently valued at an estimated $50 million, to Vanessa Harrison. She is hereby named the sole executive beneficiary and primary shareholder of this specific corporate entity, effective immediately upon the reading of this document." The room erupted. Kyle threw his hand up and loudly high-fived Vanessa right in the middle of a prestigious law firm. It was a crude, tasteless display of pure, unadulterated greed. They were acting like they had just won the lottery, completely ignoring the fact that the price of their ticket was my father's life. Beverly smiled broadly, a smug, deeply satisfied expression settling over her perfectly made-up face. She reached over and patted Vanessa on the hand, murmuring loudly about how proud she was and how my father had finally done the right thing by protecting the family image. Aunt Shirley looked absolutely sick to her stomach. She looked down at the table, unable to watch them celebrate while I sat at the other end, seemingly written out of my own family's history. Vanessa could not contain her venom. The $50 million validation had gone straight to her head, making her feel completely untouchable. She turned her body away from the lawyer and looked directly down the length of the long wooden table at me. Her eyes were wide with malicious joy, her lips curled into a cruel, triumphant smirk. "Told you, Chloe," Vanessa said, her voice loud and dripping with absolute condescension. She did not even try to hide her cruelty from our extended family anymore. "You are nothing. You have always been nothing but the hired help in this family." I sat perfectly still. I did not glare at her. I did not open my mouth to defend myself. I simply kept my hands flat on top of the red folder and let her empty, pathetic words echo through the room. "Dad knew who the real star of this family was," Vanessa continued, gesturing wildly to herself. "He knew who had the class, the education, and the vision to actually manage his incredible wealth. You spent 10 years smelling like a deep fryer, breaking your back in that disgusting commercial kitchen, trying to prove you were just as good as me. And look where it got you. You do not even have a childhood bedroom to go back to. I own the house. I own the company. I own the legacy. You have absolutely nothing. So whatever little lawsuit you think you have in that ridiculous red folder, you might as well throw it in the trash on your way out the door." Kyle chimed in, leaning back in his expensive chair and crossing his arms behind his head. Looks like you are going to need that minimum wage cafeteria job after all, Chloe. But honestly, after the stunt you pulled with your security guard yesterday, I do not think you are a good culture fit for my new tech firm. You are officially on your own. They were so desperate for my reaction. They needed me to be shattered so they could finally feel whole. They wanted me to cry, to scream about how unfair it all was, to beg my mother to intervene. But I knew something they did not. I knew that my father was a self-made, brilliant African-American man who despised laziness and entitlement more than anything else in the entire world. He was a man who played three-dimensional chess while the rest of the family was playing checkers. He would never, under any circumstances, hand his life's work over to a parasite like Kyle. Mr. Sterling did not try to shush Vanessa. He did not slam his gavel or ask for order in the room. He was a seasoned corporate attorney who had overseen hundreds of hostile takeovers and bitter family disputes. He simply sat there, silent and still, letting my sister's toxic tirade burn itself out. He knew that the higher she climbed on her pedestal of arrogance, the harder the inevitable fall was going to be. He kept his eyes focused entirely on the heavy stack of legal documents resting on the desk in front of him. Slowly, deliberately, he turned one more crisp white page. The loud, heavy rustle of the thick paper cut sharply through Vanessa's arrogant laughter. Mr. Sterling waited until the entire room fell dead silent again. The sudden shift in his posture commanded absolute attention. He slowly raised his head, looked right past Kyle's smug grin, and fixed his piercing, intimidating gaze directly on my sister. He reached up, carefully adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses, and delivered the magic words with the ruthless precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "Did you even bother to read the addendum, Vanessa?" The smile on Vanessa's face froze completely, looking as though it had been carved out of cheap plastic. The arrogant, triumphant energy that had filled her side of the room vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, heavy confusion. She blinked twice, her heavy fake eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks. "What addendum?" Vanessa asked, her voice losing its shrill confidence and dropping into a defensive, uncertain register. "I am the sole heir to the estate. You just read it yourself." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He calmly reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents, this one bound with a thick black legal seal. He set it gently on top of the first stack, his movements precise and unhurried. "I read the primary distribution of the parent holding company." "Vanessa," Mr. Sterling corrected her, speaking slowly and deliberately, as if he were explaining a very simple concept to a very slow child. "But a holding company does exactly what the name implies. It holds paper. It is a corporate umbrella. 3 years ago, your father realized that the legacy he built was incredibly vulnerable to mismanagement. He wanted to ensure that the people who actually knew how to run the business were the ones holding the keys to the engine." Kyle leaned forward, the smugness completely wiped from his face. His eyes were darting rapidly between Mr. Sterling and the sealed document. He had spent years pretending to be a brilliant venture capitalist, so he actually understood the terrifying legal implications of what Mr. Sterling was about to say. "What did Harrison do?" Kyle demanded, his voice tight and breathless. 3 years ago," Mr. Sterling explained, looking directly at Kyle, "your father legally divested the Harrison Holding Company of all its physical, depreciating, and revenue-generating assets." Vanessa threw her hands up in the air. "What does that even mean in English, Sterling? Stop talking in circles and tell me what I own." "It means you own the logo, Vanessa," Mr. Sterling said, his voice completely flat. "You own the corporate stationery. You own the brand name and the public-facing website. But you do not own a single truck. You do not own the massive commercial real estate parcels where those trucks are currently parked. You do not own the maintenance facilities. And most importantly, your holding company does not possess the state and federal operating licenses required to legally move freight across state lines." The color began to drain from Vanessa's face. her heavy foundation suddenly looking like a pale mask. "Wait," she stammered, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "If my company does not own the trucks or the licenses, then who does? Where did all the actual property go?" "Your father transferred every single physical asset, the entire operating engine of the $50 million empire, into a completely separate, privately held corporate entity named Harrison Operations LLC," Mr. Sterling revealed. Kyle swallowed hard, the sound audible in the dead-silent room. "And who owns Harrison Operations?" Kyle asked, though the trembling in his hands suggested he already knew the devastating answer. Mr. Sterling finally looked away from them. He turned his head and looked all the way down the long expanse of the wooden table, locking eyes with me. A profound, deep sense of vindication settled over my chest. My father had seen me. Even when I thought he was ignoring my sacrifices, he had been quietly building an ironclad fortress to protect my future. Chloe Harrison is the sole 100% equity owner and presiding chief executive officer of Harrison Operations LLC, Mr. Sterling announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. Aunt Shirley let out a loud, shocked gasp. Uncle David leaned back in his chair, a slow, incredibly proud smile spreading across his weathered face. Beverly dropped her gold fountain pen. It clattered loudly against the wood, her cruise catalog suddenly forgotten. "That is a lie!" Vanessa screamed, jumping up from her chair so violently that it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is a cook. She does not know anything about logistics. Dad would never give her the actual company." "You are making this up. I highly recommend you lower your voice and take a seat, Vanessa," Mr. Sterling warned, his tone suddenly sharp and entirely unforgiving. "I have been practicing corporate law for 40 years, and I do not forge documents. Your father transferred the physical assets to Chloe because she is the only person in this family with a proven, documented history of successfully managing a multi-million-dollar business operation." Vanessa stood there, her chest heaving, completely paralyzed by the destruction of her entire reality. She looked at me, expecting me to gloat. But I just sat there, perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the red folder. I did not need to scream to prove my power. Kyle was hyperventilating slightly. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning entirely white. "Okay, wait," Kyle said, trying desperately to salvage his shattered crypto funding plans. "If Chloe owns the trucks, how is Vanessa's holding company supposed to fulfill its shipping contracts? The holding company is legally obligated to move freight for its clients." "That brings us to the final clause of the addendum," Mr. Sterling continued, adjusting his glasses once more. "Since the holding company has no physical means to move freight, it must lease the equipment. 3 years ago, your father signed an ironclad, irrevocable 10-year leasing agreement between your holding company and Chloe's operating entity." "What kind of leasing agreement?" Kyle demanded, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "To use Chloe's fleet of trucks, Chloe's warehouses, and Chloe's federal licenses, your holding company is legally contracted to pay Harrison Operations LLC a comprehensive equipment leasing fee." Mr. Sterling read directly from the page. "That fee is exactly $3 million, due on the first of every single month." The sheer magnitude of the number hit the room like a physical shockwave. $3 million a month. Vanessa's holding company might have been valued at $50 million on paper, but its actual cash flow was going to be entirely devoured by the massive lease payments she now owed to me. She was not the queen of the empire. She was essentially my heavily indebted employee, working her entire life just to pay me rent on her own inheritance. "I will cancel it," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "I am the CEO of the holding company. I will just tear up the contract and buy my own trucks." "You cannot cancel it," Mr. Sterling replied calmly. "It is an irrevocable contract, bound tightly by the terms of the probate. And you cannot buy your own trucks because the holding company does not have the liquid capital to purchase an entirely new fleet while simultaneously paying out your clients. You are entirely dependent on Chloe's assets. Then we will just default." Kyle snapped, trying to sound tough but completely failing to hide his rising terror. We will refuse to pay her. Let her try to sue us. We will drag it out in court for a decade until her operating company goes bankrupt from legal fees. I finally moved. I slowly opened the thick red folder sitting in front of me. I pulled out a single sheet of heavily embossed paper and slid it straight down the long, polished mahogany table. It glided perfectly, stopping right in front of Kyle's shaking hands. I do not need to sue you, Kyle, I said, my voice smooth, calm, and ringing with absolute authority. Read the default clause. Kyle looked down at the paper. It was the first official invoice from Harrison Operations LLC, billing Vanessa for the first $3 million payment. Printed directly beneath the total amount was the legal default stipulation my father and Mr. Sterling had drafted. Kyle read the text, and I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain entirely from his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and crush him. "What does it say, Kyle?" Vanessa demanded, shaking his shoulder aggressively. "Read it to me." Kyle could barely get the words out. His voice was a hollow, defeated whisper. "It says that if the holding company misses a single monthly payment or is late by more than 24 hours, Harrison Operations LLC has the legal right to immediately seize all corporate and personal collateral to cover the breach of contract." Vanessa snatched the paper from his hands. "What collateral?" she asked, scanning the page frantically. Mr. Sterling closed his thick leather binder, the heavy thud signaling the absolute end of the legal proceedings. "The collateral explicitly listed in the addendum to secure the lease," Mr. Sterling announced, looking directly at my sister, "is the remaining balance of the Harrison Family Trust Fund and the deed to the $8 million Fairfield estate." The room went completely silent. The trap had been sprung, and the steel jaws had snapped shut around them with terrifying force. If Vanessa missed one single payment, if her holding company failed to generate $3 million in profit every 30 days, I had the legal, ironclad right to seize the mansion she had just kicked me out of. I had the right to seize the very trust fund Kyle had been planning to use to pay off his aggressive crypto investors. They were entirely at my mercy. I looked at my sister, who was staring at the paper with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized the absolute truth. My father had not left her an empire. He had left her a gilded cage, and he had given me the only key. The heavy silence in Mr. Sterling's office felt completely different now. Just 10 minutes ago, the quiet had been filled with my sister's suffocating arrogance and my brother-in-law's smug superiority. Now the silence was thick with their absolute, unadulterated terror. Vanessa was staring at the default clause printed on the paper Kyle had dropped, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was holding her breath, as if making a single sound might trigger the complete collapse of her stolen empire. I did not let them sit in that fragile quiet for long. I reached back into my thick red folder. I pulled out a second document, printed on heavy watermarked corporate stationery. It was flawless, legally binding, and completely merciless. With a steady hand, I placed it flat on the polished mahogany wood and slid it firmly down the center of the long table. It glided past Aunt Shirley and Uncle David, sliding right past Mr. Sterling's leather binder, and came to a perfect stop directly in front of Vanessa. "That is your first official invoice," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a newly sharpened chef knife. "It is fully prorated for the month, effective the exact moment Mr. Sterling concluded the reading of the will. $3 million, payable immediately to Harrison Operations LLC. You can write a check, or you can authorize a direct wire transfer. I strongly suggest the wire transfer, because if a check bounces, I will seize the mansion by Monday morning." Vanessa looked down at the pristine piece of paper as if it were a live grenade resting on the table. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She looked at Kyle, but Kyle was completely paralyzed. His eyes were glazed over, his mind frantically calculating the millions of dollars he owed to aggressive private investors. money he had borrowed against an inheritance he did not actually control. The spell of shock was suddenly broken, not by Vanessa or Kyle, but by my mother. Beverly let out a loud, theatrical gasp. The realization had finally pierced through her delusion. The endless stream of unlimited wealth, the European Mediterranean cruises she had been circling in her catalog just moments ago, the country club memberships, and the absolute financial security she had always enjoyed were suddenly tethered directly to my goodwill. And she knew she had entirely destroyed any goodwill I had left. She jumped up from her plush leather chair so fast that her designer handbag tumbled to the floor, spilling expensive cosmetics across the expensive rug. She ignored it. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face twisting into a mask of absolute outrage and sudden, desperate panic. "You cannot do this!" Beverly shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls of the conference room. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "This is insane! You are trying to bankrupt your own sister. We are a family, Chloe. How can you sit there and extort your own flesh and blood like some kind of ruthless criminal?" I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly on the table. "Extortion implies I am asking for something I do not own, Mother," I replied calmly. "I am simply collecting the rent on my property that my father legally entrusted to me because he knew I was the only one who could manage it." Beverly slammed her hands down on the table, leaning forward aggressively. "Your father must have been out of his mind when he signed those papers," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "He was sick. The cancer was eating his brain. You manipulated a dying man, Chloe. You sneaked into his hospital room when we were not looking, and you tricked him into signing away Vanessa's birthright." The sheer audacity of her accusations sent a hot, bright spark of anger straight through my chest, but I refused to let it show on my face. I remembered the long, agonizing nights sitting in the sterile hospital room. I remembered holding my father's bruised hand while the machines beeped relentlessly. I remembered how the nurses always asked where the rest of his family was, and I had to lie and say they were resting. "I did not trick him," I said, keeping my volume entirely regulated. "I sat with him. For weeks. I held his hand while he suffered. Meanwhile, you were busy picking out custom funeral dresses, and Kyle was busy measuring my childhood bedroom for a virtual golf simulator. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He was protecting his legacy from vultures." "You have to tear that contract up right now," Beverly demanded, completely ignoring my words. She rounded the table, taking several steps toward me before Mr. Sterling held up a stern hand to stop her. She stopped, but she continued to yell, her voice growing increasingly frantic and desperate. "You have to sign those trucks and those licenses over to the holding company right this second, Chloe. You know Vanessa cannot afford a $3 million lease. You know she does not have that kind of liquid cash. And you know Kyle does not know how to run a real business." A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the room. Beverly had just screamed the quiet part out loud. In her blind panic to save her golden child, she had openly admitted what the entire family already knew, but refused to say. Kyle was a complete fraud. Kyle's head snapped up. The remaining color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, furious flush. "Excuse me," Kyle spat out, his voice vibrating with humiliated rage. "I am a venture capitalist. I have managed multi-million-dollar portfolios. You lost $5 million of investor money on a fake cryptocurrency app last year, Kyle," Beverly snapped back at him, completely throwing her son-in-law under the bus to save her daughter. "Do not play games with me right now. You do not know the first thing about freight logistics or managing a supply chain. If you take control of those trucks, you will crash the entire company into the ground within a month, and we will all lose everything." She turned her desperate, tear-streaked face back to me. Her tone suddenly shifted from aggressive demands to pathetic, manipulative pleading. "Chloe, please," she sobbed, clutching her hands against her chest. "She is your sister. She is not built for this kind of stress. You have always been the strong one. You have always been the one who knows how to handle the hard work. It is your job to protect her. If you enforce this lease, Kyle will ruin the company, they will lose the mansion, and our family will be destroyed. You are tearing this family apart over money." The room was completely silent, save for the sound of my mother's ragged breathing. Aunt Shirley was quietly wiping a tear from her eye, appalled by Beverly's behavior. Uncle David was staring at his hands, shaking his head in disgust. They were all waiting to see if the lifelong conditioning would kick in. They were waiting to see if I would bow my head, absorb the guilt, and sacrifice my own future to clean up Vanessa's mess, just like I had done my entire life. I took a slow, deep breath. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. I stood up. I was wearing my favorite tailored suit, the one I had bought with my own catering profits. I felt 10 feet tall. "My job," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, echoing with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Since when is it my job to subsidize her life?" I looked directly into my mother's eyes, refusing to let her look away. "For 35 years, I was the family mule, and she was your show pony. You spent my entire life grooming her for luxury and grooming me for labor. When I started my catering business, you called it a cute little kitchen hobby. You expected me to serve appetizers at my own father's repast for free, just so Vanessa could impress Kyle's fake investor friends. Chloe, that is not fair," Beverly whimpered, taking a step back. "What is not fair?" I interrupted, my voice finally rising, filling the massive conference room with decades of suppressed righteous anger. "What is not fair is that less than 24 hours after we put my father in the ground, you let her kick me out of my childhood home. You watched her drop an eviction notice on my bed. You stood in the hallway and told me to be the bigger person and leave quietly so I would not stress her out. You watched Kyle walk into my commercial kitchen 2 days ago with a fake legal document, trying to illegally seize the only thing I have ever built for myself. And you did not shed a single tear for me. Not one." Beverly opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had absolutely no defense. "You wanted Vanessa to have the crown, Mother," I said, staring at the woman who had failed to protect me my entire life, "so now she has to carry the weight of it. I will not tear up the contract, I will not sign over the trucks, and I will not apologize for taking exactly what my father gave me. I am entirely done being the backbone of a family that treats me like dirt. And I am completely done setting myself on fire just to keep your golden child warm." I broke eye contact with my mother and looked down the table at Vanessa. She was openly weeping now, her designer mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She was staring at the $3 million invoice as if it were her own death warrant. "Pay your rent, Vanessa," I told her coldly, "or pack your bags." I turned my attention to the head of the table. Mr. Sterling was watching me with a look of profound, quiet respect. "Are we finished here, Mr. Sterling?" I asked politely. "The reading of the will is officially concluded," Mr. Sterling confirmed, nodding his head. "The estate is now in probate. Harrison Operations LLC is fully recognized as the sole operating entity." "Thank you," I said. I picked up my red folder, tucking it securely under my arm. I gave a small, respectful nod to Aunt Shirley and Uncle David, who both offered me incredibly proud, supportive smiles. I did not look back at my mother, my sister, or my brother-in-law. I turned and walked out of the conference room. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, a steady rhythm of absolute victory. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and walked out into the bright, sunlit reception area. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was not entirely over yet. Kyle was a desperate, cornered animal. The moment I left that building, he was going to realize that his crypto investors were going to demand the money he no longer had. The dominoes were fully set up, and I had just tipped the first one over. Now, all I had to do was step back and watch their entire stolen world come crashing down. 3 days passed since the reading of the will. While my sister and her husband were trapped in the wreckage of their own greed, I was busy doing what I had done my entire adult life. I went back to work. The 500-person corporate gala we catered that weekend was an absolute triumph. My staff executed the menu flawlessly, the tech executives were thrilled, and we secured a massive 2-year retainer contract before the dessert plates were even cleared. It was Monday morning, and I was sitting at the heavy mahogany desk in my office, sipping a hot cup of black coffee. The sun was streaming through the glass walls, catching the steam rising from my mug. I was reviewing the final architectural blueprints for my new flagship event space, a multi-million-dollar venue I was launching entirely under my own name. I felt a profound sense of peace. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my family's expectations had finally been lifted. I was no longer the scapegoat, and I was no longer the family mule. I was the architect of my own empire. The red emergency line on my desk began to ring, breaking the quiet concentration of the morning. I reached over and picked up the receiver. It was Richard, the senior branch manager at my commercial bank. Just a few days ago, he had called this exact line to tell me Kyle had fraudulently frozen my business accounts. Today, his tone was completely different. He did not sound apologetic or tense. He sounded almost breathless with disbelief. "Chloe," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial whisper. "I know I am technically crossing a professional line by calling you about this, but given what your brother-in-law tried to do to you last week, I thought you deserved to hear the news directly from me before it hits the local financial blogs." I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "I am listening, Richard. What did Kyle do this time?" Richard let out a sharp sigh that sounded a lot like a suppressed laugh. "The word on the street is that your brother-in-law is in massive, catastrophic financial trouble. Over the weekend, the dominoes completely collapsed on his new tech startup." I set my coffee mug down. Kyle's tech startup was always a running joke in our family, a vague, undefined cryptocurrency venture that he used to justify his expensive suits and endless networking lunches. But I never realized the actual scale of his delusion until Richard started explaining the details. "It turns out," Richard continued, "Kyle has been aggressively borrowing money from some very dangerous, unregulated private equity investors. Shadow bankers. The kind of guys who do not send polite collection letters when you miss a payment. He took out close to $10 million in short-term, high-interest loans to cover his failing crypto bets." "How did he secure a $10 million loan?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "Kyle does not own anything of value. His last 3 companies filed for bankruptcy." "That is the absolute kicker," Richard replied. "He leveraged Vanessa's inheritance. Weeks before your father even passed away, Kyle was telling these aggressive investors that his wife was the sole heir to the Harrison Logistics Holding Company. He used the estimated $50 million valuation of the estate as collateral to secure the cash. He promised the investors that the moment the will was read, he would liquidate a portion of the company's assets to pay them back with massive interest." A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. Kyle had actually spent Vanessa's inheritance before she even officially received it. He was playing a massive, high-stakes shell game with money he did not even control. "But then Friday happened," Richard said, his voice laced with absolute vindication. "The reading of the will became public record. The investors had their legal teams do a deep dive into the probate filings over the weekend. They discovered Mr. Sterling's addendum. They realized that Vanessa's holding company does not actually own a single truck, warehouse, or operating license. And they saw the leasing contract," I added, the entire beautiful picture coming into perfect focus. "Exactly," Richard confirmed. "They saw that the holding company is legally bound to pay your operating entity $3 million a month just to keep the lights on." From a financial standpoint, Vanessa's company is not an asset at all. It is a massive liability. The collateral Kyle used to secure those $10 million is essentially worthless paper. I looked out through the glass walls of my office, watching my prep cooks methodically chop vegetables for the afternoon lunch rush. My father's genius was absolutely staggering. He knew exactly what Kyle was capable of. He knew Kyle would try to bleed the company dry to fund his own ego. By stripping the holding company of its physical assets, my father had not just protected the family legacy, he had built a trap, and Kyle had walked right into it with his eyes wide open. So what happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The investors panicked, Richard explained. When you are dealing with shadow equity, they do not wait for court dates. They enacted the penalty clauses in Kyle's loan agreements immediately. First thing this morning, they filed aggressive liens against every single asset tied to Kyle and Vanessa's names. Their personal checking accounts, their joint savings, their investment portfolios. Every single dime they have access to has been completely frozen. Karma is a shockingly efficient worker. Just 5 days ago, Kyle had strutted into my commercial kitchen, waving a fake legal document and threatening to starve me out by freezing my accounts. He had mocked me, telling me to enjoy my minimum wage life. And now, the exact weapon he tried to use against me had been turned around and detonated right in his face. "Thank you for letting me know, Richard," I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "I appreciate the heads up." "Enjoy your Monday, Chloe," Richard replied warmly before hanging up. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. I sat in the quiet of my office, letting the absolute magnitude of their failure sink in. They had tried to destroy me. They had kicked me out of my childhood home and tried to erase my entire existence from the family legacy. But the universe has a very specific way of balancing the scales. Before I could even pick up my pen to return to my blueprints, my cell phone buzzed violently on the desk. The screen lit up, vibrating against the polished wood. The caller ID displayed my mother's name, Beverly. I did not answer it. I had absolutely nothing left to say to the woman who had stood by and watched her golden child try to ruin my life. I let the phone vibrate until it finally went to voicemail. A minute later, a small notification popped up on the screen indicating she had left an audio message. I reached over, unlocked the phone, and pressed play on the voicemail. I put the phone on speaker and set it down on the desk. "Chloe!" Beverly's voice screamed through the small speaker. She was absolutely hysterical, her words completely frantic and breathless. "Pick up the phone! You have to pick up the phone right now!" In the background of the audio, I could hear a loud, heavy mechanical grinding noise, followed by the sharp, angry shouts of men giving directions. "They are taking the cars, Chloe!" my mother sobbed, her voice cracking with pure terror. 3 tow trucks just pulled into the circular driveway. They have legal papers. They are hooking up Vanessa's Mercedes and Kyle's Porsche. They said the accounts are frozen and the vehicles are being repossessed to cover a debt. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the chaotic symphony of their downfall. "Kyle is inside tearing the office apart." Beverly continued to cry into the phone, the sound of a heavy diesel engine roaring in the background as one of the luxury cars was pulled onto a flatbed. "Vanessa is locked in her bedroom screaming. The credit cards are declining. The bank will not even let me withdraw grocery money. We have absolutely nothing. You have to call the investors, Chloe. You have to tell them you own the trucks and you will guarantee the loans. Please, you have to save us. Call me back." The voicemail ended with a sharp beep. The silence returned to my office, broken only by the faint, comforting sounds of my culinary team working out on the prep floor. I looked at the phone. I looked at the blueprints for my new, massive event space. I thought about the decades of subtle insults, the constant comparisons to Vanessa's lighter skin and perfect hair, the expectation that I would always be the workhorse while they enjoyed the carriage ride. I thought about Kyle measuring my bedroom for a golf simulator the day after we buried the only man who ever truly loved me. Save them. The very concept was absurd. I picked up my cell phone, navigated to the recent calls list, and firmly pressed the block button next to my mother's name. I tossed the phone into my desk drawer and closed it shut. The repo men had arrived, the bank accounts were locked, and the golden child was finally learning the true cost of her unearned crown. The dominoes were falling fast, and I was going to let every single one of them hit the ground. 5 days. It had been exactly 5 days since Vanessa marched into my childhood bedroom and dropped an eviction notice onto my perfectly made bed. In the grand scheme of a lifetime, 5 days is nothing but a fleeting whisper. But in the ruthless, high-stakes world of business and karma, 5 days was all it took to completely reverse the natural order of my universe. While their stolen empire was rapidly crumbling into dust, mine was officially opening its doors to the public. It was Thursday evening, and the sky above the city had opened up into a massive, torrential downpour. But inside the thick, soundproofed walls of my brand new flagship event space, the atmosphere was nothing short of magical. I had named the venue the Luminary. It was a massive, historic downtown building that I had spent the last 2 years and millions of my own hard-earned dollars painstakingly restoring. I kept the original exposed brick walls and the soaring 30-foot ceilings, but I modernized the space with breathtaking crystal chandeliers, sweeping velvet drapery, and a state-of-the-art commercial kitchen that rivaled any Michelin-starred restaurant in the country. Tonight was our grand opening gala, and it was a massive, undeniable milestone. Standing in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by the elite of the city, I fully grasped the historical and cultural weight of the moment. For generations, African American women in this city had been relegated to the back of the house. We were the unseen labor. We were the cooks, the cleaners, and the silent backbone of the hospitality industry. But tonight, I was not in the back of the house. I owned the entire building. I held the deed, I signed the paychecks, and I was the one standing in the spotlight. I was wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored emerald green gown that caught the ambient light with every step I took. My hair was styled in flawless, sweeping waves, and my makeup was immaculate. I felt absolutely radiant. There was not a single ounce of stress or guilt weighing down my shoulders. I had not checked my phone for family updates. I had not unblocked my mother's number. I was entirely unbothered by the financial hurricane I had unleashed upon them because I was too busy basking in the warm, golden glow of my own success. The room was packed with over 300 esteemed guests. Waitstaff circulated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with my signature hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes of premium vintage champagne. A live jazz quartet played a smooth, upbeat set on the elevated stage, filling the cavernous space with a rich, celebratory energy. I spent the first 2 hours of the evening doing exactly what Kyle had always pretended to do. I networked. But unlike Kyle, I actually had the substance to back up my style. I walked from table to table, shaking hands and sealing relationships. I secured a massive holiday party contract with a major corporate law firm. I negotiated a preferred vendor agreement with the local Chamber of Commerce. Every conversation I had was a testament to the flawless reputation I had spent a decade building from scratch. Just past 8 o'clock, the mayor himself took the stage. He tapped the microphone, drawing the attention of the crowded room. The jazz band faded out, and a respectful hush fell over the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, raising his glass toward me. "We are here tonight to celebrate more than just a beautiful new building. We are here to celebrate the relentless spirit of entrepreneurship. Chloe Harrison represents the very best of our city. She started with a vision, she put in the grueling hours, and she built a business that not only provides unparalleled service, but also creates vital jobs for our community. Chloe, your father was a legendary figure in our local economy, and I know he would be incredibly proud to see you carrying on his legacy of excellence tonight. To Chloe and to the Luminary." The entire room erupted into applause. 300 people raised their glasses in my direction. The flashbulbs from local journalists and society photographers illuminated the room in rapid succession. I smiled brightly, raising my own glass of sparkling water in acknowledgement. It was the ultimate validation. My father's true legacy was not a holding company on a piece of paper. It was the work ethic he had instilled in me, and the entire city was recognizing it. I stepped off the main floor and walked toward the edge of the ballroom to take a brief moment for myself. I watched my head chef, Jamal, directing the carving stations with absolute precision. Everything was running flawlessly. I took a deep, centering breath, letting the scent of roasted meats and expensive perfume fill my lungs. Just as I turned to head back toward a group of potential investors, I felt a heavy presence materialize beside me. It was Elijah, my head of security. He was wearing a sharp black suit, an earpiece discreetly tucked into his right ear. He did not look panicked, because Elijah never panicked, but the rigid set of his jaw told me immediately that something was wrong. He leaned down, keeping his voice incredibly low so as not to disturb the guests mingling just a few feet away. "I am sorry to interrupt your evening, Ms. Harrison," Elijah whispered, "but we have a situation at the main entrance." I kept my smile perfectly fixed in place, nodding slowly as if he were simply giving me an update on the coat check. "What kind of situation, Elijah? Did a reporter try to sneak in without a press pass?" "No, ma'am," Elijah replied, his tone flat and serious. "It is your sister and her husband. They are trying to force their way into the lobby." The name sent a brief, cold ripple through my stomach, but it was quickly swallowed by the absolute certainty of my power in this building. I looked toward the front of the venue. The main entrance was separated from the ballroom by a long, beautifully decorated foyer and a set of heavy, frosted glass doors. The music and the laughter of the party completely masked whatever chaos was happening out on the street. "Are they causing a scene?" I asked calmly. "My guys have them contained at the outer doors," Elijah assured me. "They bypassed the street-level valet barricade, but we stopped them before they could get into the actual lobby. The husband is doing a lot of yelling, claiming he is an owner. The wife is just crying. I can have the local precinct send a squad car right now to haul them away for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Just give me the word." Having them arrested in front of the local press corps on the night of my grand opening would certainly be a fitting end to their disastrous week. It would be the ultimate public humiliation. But sending them away in the back of a police cruiser felt too easy. It would allow them to play the victims of a misunderstanding. I needed them to look me in the eye. I needed them to see exactly what they had thrown away when they handed me that eviction notice. "Hold off on the police, Elijah," I instructed smoothly. "I will handle this. Keep the inner lobby doors locked so the guests do not see anything." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said, stepping back to escort me. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray and began the long walk across the venue. I did not rush. I took my time, my emerald gown gliding elegantly over the polished hardwood floors. I smiled and nodded at guests as I passed, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered control. I walked through the heavy, frosted glass doors, leaving the warmth and the jazz music of the ballroom behind me. I stepped into the grand entrance foyer. The space was quiet, lit by soft wall sconces. At the far end of the foyer were the massive floor-to-ceiling clear glass doors that opened directly out onto the city street. The visual contrast between my world and theirs was staggering. Inside, the air was climate-controlled, smelling of fresh floral arrangements and success. Outside, the storm was raging. The rain was coming down in thick, violent sheets, bouncing off the concrete sidewalks and flooding the gutters. Standing right on the other side of my glass doors, completely exposed to the brutal elements, were Vanessa and Kyle. I stopped a few feet away from the glass, just watching them for a moment. They looked absolutely wrecked. This was not the arrogant, designer-clad couple that had strutted into Mr. Sterling's law office just days ago. The repo men, the frozen accounts, and the sheer terror of absolute financial ruin had aged them both 10 years in the span of a single weekend. Vanessa was shivering violently. She was wearing a pair of expensive sweatpants and a silk blouse, completely inappropriate for the weather, with a beige trench coat hastily thrown over her shoulders. Her perfectly maintained blonde hair was plastered to her skull in wet, heavy strands. The designer mascara she always wore like war paint was running down her cheeks in dark, muddy rivers. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. Kyle looked even worse. He was wearing the same suit he had worn when Elijah threw him into the alleyway at my commercial kitchen. It was stained and rumpled. He was soaked to the bone, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He was aggressively gripping the brass handles of the locked glass doors, rattling them in a futile attempt to get inside. He was shouting something at the two massive security guards standing on the other side of the glass, his face contorted in desperate panic. But the thick soundproofing blocked his voice entirely. They were drowning. And they had come to the very woman they tried to destroy, begging for a life raft. I took one final deep breath, signaling Elijah to unlock the heavy glass doors. It was time to step out into the rain and finish this. Elijah pulled the heavy glass door open, and I stepped out into the covered entryway. The sudden drop in temperature hit me instantly. The humid, freezing wind whipped across the concrete, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and city rain. Behind me, the muffled, joyful sounds of the jazz quartet continued to play. In front of me, the absolute destruction of my family was on full display. Vanessa saw me first. She let out a loud, pathetic gasp, completely abandoning whatever shred of dignity she had left. She pushed past the two security guards, who looked to Elijah for the signal. Elijah gave a subtle nod, allowing them to step back just enough to let her approach the edge of the awning. "Chloe," Vanessa sobbed, her voice cracking over the sound of the torrential rain. "Oh my God, Chloe, please, you have to help us. You have to stop this." She stood shivering in the cold, her beige trench coat soaked through, her expensive silk blouse clinging to her skin. The woman who had told me I was nothing, the woman who had smirked as I packed my bags, was now weeping uncontrollably. "They took the cars," Vanessa cried, wrapping her arms around herself. "The bank froze every single account. The credit cards are declining. Kyle's investors are threatening him. They said if we do not wire the money by tomorrow morning, they are going to take the house. They are going to take Dad's house, Chloe. You have to tear up the lease. Sign the trucks back over to the holding company. Please, I will put you on the executive board. I will give you whatever you want. Just save us." I looked from my sister to my brother-in-law. Kyle was standing just a few feet behind her, entirely exposed to the downpour. His hair was plastered to his forehead. The expensive tailored suit he had worn to intimidate me in my commercial kitchen was completely ruined, heavy with rain and street grime. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. The shadow bankers he had borrowed millions from were not the kind of people who accepted apologies or forged legal documents. They wanted their money, and Kyle finally realized he was entirely powerless to give it to them. Kyle slowly walked forward. He stopped right at the edge of the covered entryway, looking down at the wet concrete. And then, the man who had mocked my father's legacy, the man who had told me to pack my little cooking pots, slowly dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the wet pavement echoed loudly over the rain. He knelt right there in the puddles, the dirty water soaking right through the fabric of his trousers. "I am sorry," Kyle said, his voice entirely broken. "I was wrong, Chloe. I was so incredibly wrong. I should never have spoken to you that way. I should never have come to your kitchen. I am begging you. If you enforce that default clause, I am going to go to prison. They are going to destroy me. Please, Chloe, you are family. Have mercy." I stood there in my emerald green gown, completely dry, completely safe, and completely untouched by their storm. I looked down at them, absorbing the absolute irreversible shift in the power dynamic. Just a few days ago, they had stood in my childhood bedroom and demanded I leave. They had expected me to cry. They had expected me to shrink. But standing here now, looking at them begging on the wet concrete, I realized something incredibly profound. I felt absolutely zero pity. I did not feel the need to yell at them. I did not feel the need to gloat or scream about how unfair they had been. Anger requires energy, and I was entirely done spending my energy on people who only saw my value when they needed to exploit it. They had dug this grave with their own greed, and now they were terrified of the dirt. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I turned my head slightly and looked over my shoulder. My executive assistant, Kendra, was standing just inside the glass doors, watching the scene unfold. I caught her eye and gave her a small, deliberate nod. Kendra immediately pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold. She was holding a silver clipboard with a pen securely attached to the clip. She handed it to me without saying a word and stepped back inside. I looked back down at my sister. I held the clipboard out toward her. Vanessa stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second. She stared at the clipboard, her mascara-stained eyes blinking in confusion. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to take it. "Are these the release forms? Are you canceling the lease?" I looked her dead in the eye. My voice was smooth, completely devoid of emotion and chillingly calm. "It is an application," I told her. "It is a blank job application for a dishwasher position at my catering company." Vanessa gasped, as if I had just slapped her across the face. She looked down at the standard employment form clipped to the board, the reality of the insult washing over her. Kyle let out a pathetic, choked sound from his spot on the wet pavement. "I do not do handouts, Vanessa," I said, delivering the final fatal blow to her stolen crown. "But I do pay minimum wage. Take it, or leave my property." I did not wait for her response. I did not care if she threw the clipboard into the street or if she actually filled it out. I simply turned my back on them. I walked away from the cold, the rain, and the toxic weight of my family's delusion. Elijah opened the heavy glass door for me, and I stepped back into the warm, golden light of my grand opening. The jazz music swelled, washing away the sound of the storm outside. I walked back into my ballroom, back to my clients, my staff, and the empire I had built with my own two hands. The aftermath of that night was swift and entirely merciless. By Monday morning, the shadow investors executed their liens. They seized the $8 million Fairfield estate, forcing Vanessa and Beverly to pack their designer bags and vacate the premises immediately. Because Kyle had fraudulently misrepresented the estate's assets to secure those loans, the federal authorities got involved. Just 3 weeks later, Kyle was officially indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. He is currently awaiting trial, facing up to 15 years in federal prison. Vanessa, entirely stripped of her holding company and her inherited wealth, filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce. With absolutely nowhere else to go, she moved into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment with our mother. Beverly had to sell off her extensive collection of designer handbags and cancel all her European cruises just to afford the security deposit. The golden child and her ultimate enabler were finally stuck together, forced to live in the exact reality they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. They have not called me since that night in the rain, and I have never once reached out to them. As for me, I am sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table in the boardroom of my newly expanded corporate headquarters. Harrison Operations, LLC, has doubled its fleet of trucks in the last 6 months, and the luminary is booked solid for the next 2 years. I protected my father's true legacy, but more importantly, I protected my own peace. I broke the generational curse of the black tax in our family, and I built a life of absolute, unshakable financial freedom. If you are watching this right now, and you are the scapegoat of your family, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your success to the people who mistreated you while you were building it. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal. It is an act of survival. Let them call you selfish. Let them call you bitter. Because the absolute sweetest revenge you will ever get is massive, entirely unbothered success. Thank you so much for watching my story. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace and your purpose, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below how you handled the guilt trips and the gaslighting. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder today that their worth is not determined by how their family treats them. Keep building your empire, keep protecting your peace, and I will see you in the next video.